Thank you very much for having me here. It's a great pleasure to be here in this session and presenting this paper. Before I start, just two very brief disclaimers. So I'm currently serving with the Swiss Competition Commission, and none of what I say here today reflects the view of the Competition Commission. Additionally, I was told that disclosing potential conflicts of interest is important in settings like these. So in 2021, I have consulted for Microsoft in a case that might be characterized as an acquisition of a potential competitor. So just so you know, and you can discount my views in any way you see fit. So the title of the paper is Startup Acquisitions, Acquihires, and Talent Hoarding. And I have prepared this very nice first slide where I was going to say pretty much exactly what Massimo has already told you. So just for the sake of story, please allow me to repeat. So there's been this long period where competition authorities were not particularly concerned with acquisitions of nascent or potential competitors. And that has started changing some years back. And there was this very particular example that caught the attention of the policymakers and the public, this example of killer acquisitions, right? So it has a very catchy title. And some people in this room have worked on that topic. But what was very striking, I think, to people and why this became such a prominent example is that you had these incumbent firms buying these promising startups and then shutting them down. Right? And it was this notion of shutting them down that was seen as somehow wasteful and problematic. And when people were criticizing this practice, came this defense of, yeah, sure, startups are being shut down, but the reason why they're shut down is because the acquirers never cared about the technology in the first place, never cared about the firms in the first place. They only cared about people, right? So we have these acquihires. And so just briefly to tell you what are acquihires so that we're on the same page. I like this comic very much. Kind of illustrates what's happening here. You have a big firm, an incumbent, coming in, showering the startup with money, and then just sucking the people out of it. Now, this is, I don't want to say a common practice, but it is a practice that occurs with some regularity. And we have some empirical evidence that acquisition of talent motivates acquisitions, but we also have more indirect evidence, right? So, and I like this quote by Mark Zuckerberg, who said, well, we buy companies to get excellent people. And in the paper, we have an example from around the same period where Facebook acquired a very successful startup called Dropio. And as soon as they acquired them, so it was a startup for sharing links, they acquired them and they immediately announced they're going to shut it down. But the people who were running that startup got very prominent roles within Facebook's leadership. Right? So there are examples of these types of acquisitions regularly happening. And there is some notion that authorities are starting to consider these acquihires as potentially problematic. And what I have here is a quote by an M&A lawyer who said that, well, the authorities, the American authorities, the FTC, they have not looked at acquihires so far, but they have shown interest in them. There is a possibility that they might examine them. One thing I really like about this quote is the reason for the concern, right? So she says, the agency has signaled concerns of the uneven access to talent. And this distribution of talent is going to play a central role in our paper. So what is our paper trying to do? What is our interest? So we're really interested in analyzing, as Massimo said, acquisitions where the incumbent and the startup are in completely unrelated markets. So there is absolutely no notion of potential competition. They're in unrelated markets. Acquisition of labor is the primary interest. And we want to understand if they can be harmful or not. And we have a very particular idea of where the harm might come from. And what we're going to show is that they can be harmful due to what we will call talent hoarding. So that's going to be the first result. We're going to show that this notion of talent hoarding, the distribution of talent, can be inefficient due to these types of acquihires. And once we've done that, we're going to take a closer look at consumer surplus. And the exercise we're interested in is what would happen if the authorities prohibited acquihires. We're going to characterize the effect of such prohibition on consumer surplus. And what we're going to show is that the results are subtle, and it is not straightforward to come up with a policy that increases consumer surplus. Because of the central role of talent and hiring in our paper, we're then going to look at implications for the labor market. And here we're going to find something which I find sort of interesting. We're going to show that the incentives to hoard talent are going to amplify the volatility of hiring over the business cycle. So if talent hoarding is an important incentive, we're going to see more hiring in good times and more layoffs in bad times. The model that I'm going to present here is going to be very simple, and it is the simplest model we have managed to come up with that captures the effects we're interested in. But I think that the economic mechanism is very robust. And at the end of the talk, I'm going to show you a number of extensions where the results go through. We get some additional insights, but what I'm trying to point out is that the results are not going to be sensitive to different types of extensions or changes in the model. Okay? So just when I'm going through the paper, if you start wondering, well, what if in addition to being interested in the talent, the acquiring firm is also interested partly in its technology, we can cover that. What if there is a dominant firm in the market? We have also considered that case. In the baseline, we have two firms. We will see that the effect goes through also with multiple firms. Interestingly enough, the effect is going to be non-monotonic. In the baseline model, we will only have a full acquisition, so the acquirer can just buy the entire startup. What you see very often in these markets, though, are partial investments, right? Like the incumbent putting in some money and acquiring a stake in the startup. And we can also treat these cases, and we can show that they can happen for similar reasons, also for this notion of blocking talent. Before I show you the model, I do want to spend a little bit of time on literature. So the first bullet point, what is the literature that our paper is related to, is this by now a rather rich and large literature examining the acquisitions of potential or nascent competitors. The main difference of this paper to that literature is that, as I've mentioned, the startup and the incumbent are in entirely separated markets. Right? So there is no notion of potential competition. Now, the closest paper to ours is going to be the paper that you're going to see next. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the differences. They're also going to find a reason why acquihires are inefficient, and the mechanism is going to be different from ours. But one thing I do want to point out, in our paper, we don't consider the option that the incumbent, instead of engaging in an acquihire, simply hires directly people away from the startup. And this question is a little bit of a puzzle. So whenever I was telling somebody about this project, people would ask me, well, why don't they do that? Right? Isn't that an obvious thing? Why would they go through this whole hassle of buying a startup in the first place? We have not really had a good answer in the literature so far. So the paper you're going to see next is the only paper that offers a formal explanation for why incumbents might be interested in acquiring a startup instead of directly hiring people employed at that startup. Now, there are some empirical papers that examine acquihires. These are papers mostly from management scholars, and they document certain facts which I think fit very well with what our model predicts. So they show that acquiring talent is an important consideration for incumbents. They show that acquihired employees tend to leave at a higher rate than normally hired employees. And once they leave, they're more likely to leave if the match is not very good. And once they leave, they're likely to go work for another startup again. So you will see how that will kind of come up in the model later on. So two more strains of literature which are a bit more broadly related, not as directly. So we have talent hoarding as the main channel in our paper. There's a very nice paper by Ingrid Hegele, who empirically documents talent hoarding within organizations. Okay? And what we are showing here is talent hoarding across organizations. Right? So she's showing that managers hoard talent in their own teams, right? And she can empirically document that. We'll be looking at talent hoarding across firms. Finally, this last result I told you about the volatility of hiring and firing, it relates to macroeconomic literature that has looked at this, but the results are different. So the macroeconomic literature of, they call it labor hoarding, what started as an empirical regularity and then models were built to explain it, what they document is that when there is a recession, when an economy suffers a negative shock, what you normally observe is that firms don't fire as many people as you would expect. And the explanation that these models offer is that there are costs of hiring, there's cost of training, and what the firms are doing is they're hoarding labor in the expectation that the economy is going to rebound. Now, our model is going to predict the exact opposite, right? If talent hoarding is an important incentive, we're going to see more layoffs once a negative shock hits than you would expect. So it's a contradicting prediction to this literature. And what is interesting is recent surveys have started mentioning that this observed empirical fact seems to be getting weaker over time. So I don't want to push our model too far, but maybe part of the explanation could be that incentives to talent hoard have become more important over time. And I'm going to show you some quotes at the end that sort of seem to suggest that there is something in this effect that we capture. Okay. At this stage, I'm ready to show you the model. Are there any questions before I do so? No? Very well. So here's our model. We're going to have two firms, symmetric firms, who are operating in a market. They compete and they get some profits, which we write down as capital pi, and F stands for firms. Now there's an entrepreneur running a startup in a completely separate market, no relation at all. And that startup gets some profits, lowercase pi, E. Now, each firm has a private type, and this type captures the match quality between the entrepreneur and the firm, right? And think of this as if the firm brings this entrepreneur into the firm, gives them a leadership position, how much of an impact is that going to have? Like, how good is the match? How good is the personality, knowledge, experience of that entrepreneur? How well does it fit with the current firm? So that type is theta, and we're just going to say that the probability that the match quality is high is captured by some parameter lambda. Okay, so far so good. So what the firms can do, they can try to acquihire the startup, and they do that by making an offer of some value P. And in case there is a successful acquihire, the payoffs are going to look as follows. So the firm that has made the acquihire is now going to have profits pi upper bar, upper bar indicating that this is the firm that made the acquihire. And it is, there's this theta here, and theta captures the match quality, right? So the profits are going to be different depending on whether the match quality was high or low, and the acquiring firm has to pay the acquisition price P. The other firm the firm not engaged in the acquihire, is going to have profits pi lower bar indicating here that it is the firm that's in some sense suffering from the acquihire. And this is also going to depend on the match quality theta. Entrepreneur just gets the acquisition price. Okay, so this is a very reduced form model, and what we need now are some assumptions on how these payoffs look like. And here is the assumption, which I think is a very natural one. So we're going to assume that in case of an acquihire, the joint profits of the firm and the startup, and remember, startup has been shut down, so the joint profits of the acquiring firm and the startup are highest when the match quality is high. They're lowest when the match quality is low, and they're intermediate if there is no acquihire in the first. So the way to think about this is we only have these two types, but you could think of a continuum of types. Our model would easily extend to that case, and then you would simply classify all those types where the joint profits are below this cutoff as low types and above this cutoff as high types. Why is this cutoff important? Because it captures the difference between the types that would engage in an acquihire in the absence of strategic incentives, right? The high types, they want to get the entrepreneur because it is worth the cost, right? If you bring the entrepreneur into your firm, there will be some positive surplus, while the low types would not want to do that. The surplus of that acquihire is negative, right? So in the absence of any strategic incentives, you would only see these types of acquihires. And now here is an important assumption that we make. And it is an assumption that is pretty much driving our story, namely that if your competitor engages in an acquihire, it's going to hurt you, right? So my profits, if there is no acquihire, they decrease if a low type makes an acquihire, and they decrease even further if a high type gets an acquihire. And the intuition here is really that my competitor is getting this new resource, this new members of the team who are very good, and they're going to become more efficient, more competitive, and they're going to hurt my profits if they do that, right? So in the paper, we have a very simple example of a Cournot model where an acquihire leads to a reduction of your production costs, and these assumptions are always satisfied. So they're unrelated in the sense of they are not competing against each other, and they're not on the path to compete with each other. But the entrepreneur possesses some skills or some qualities that are going to be beneficial to the acquiring firms, right? Right. So the example I gave in the beginning, Facebook acquired this startup Dropio. They had no interest in a firm that provides service of sharing links, but they wanted to get the guys that built this product, right? Because they thought they're very good. And they actually put them in charge of developing Facebook's platform, right? So they gave them a different task, but that is the idea. Now, the timeline is going to be a sequential game. 2 stages. Firm 1 is the firm that first, let's say, discovers the startup. It discovers the startup, learns the quality of its match, and then can make a bid to the startup. Entrepreneur can accept or reject the bid. If the bid is accepted, then the game ends. If it's rejected, then we go to the next stage, and the next stage is just repeated just with firm 2, right? So now firm 2 discovers the startup, learns the quality of the match, makes a bid to acquire it, entrepreneur accepts or rejects, and then the game ends. Now, there are a lot of simplifying assumptions in this structure that we don't necessarily need, but they make it easier for us to show you the results. So implicitly here, firms are making a take it or leave it offer. So that means that in some sense, firms are getting the entire bargaining surplus. We don't need that, but it's easier to explain the results if you write it down like this. We don't even need that firms know whether they are in stage 1 or in stage 2. But there needs to be some kind of a notion that the low match firm is afraid that a high match firm is going to get the startup if they don't act, right? So what you need, and there are different ways in which you can get that. We found that this one is the simplest way of modeling that. So I have talked a lot about talent hoarding without really telling you what I mean by talent hoarding. So we define talent hoarding as a situation where a firm employs workers, although they could be more efficiently employed elsewhere. And in the model, this is going to mean that a low-type firm makes the acquisition. Right? The reason why a low-type firm making an acquisition always leads to talent hoarding, according to our definition, is because it would have always been more efficient to just let the entrepreneurs stay in the startup. Right? Additionally, there is a chance that the other firm might be a high match, and then it would be even more efficient if they went there, but that's not necessary. Right? So whenever you have a low match firm making the acquisition, that leads to talent hoarding in our model. And here again, I just want to repeat that this inefficient talent hoarding would never happen in the absence of strategic incentives. When there are strategic incentives, talent hoarding can happen. And here's our first result that shows when that happens. So firm one's behavior is uniquely specified. So whenever it is a high match, it's going to make the acquihire because that increases joint profits. But if it is a low match, and if this condition holds, firm one is also going to engage in an acquihire, right? It's going to make an offer to the startup that the startup is going to accept. And what this condition says, it says that the probability of a high match needs to be high enough. It needs to be higher than some cutoff. And the intuition for this is that the low match firm makes this acquihire only because it is afraid that its competitor is a high type. And if the competitor gets the entrepreneur, they're going to suffer a loss in profits, right? So the only reason why a low type firm makes an acquihire is to avoid that outcome, right? So the probability that my competitor is a high type needs to be sufficiently high. And then here, this part is really just the efficiency loss, the effective cost of this acquihire. And here is how much I stand to lose if a high type competitor actually engages in this acquihire. Okay, so let's see what happens with consumer surplus. So far I have only written down profits, so we don't know exactly how consumer surplus look. So from the perspective of consumers, there are three possible things that can happen here. Either there was no acquihire, in which case the two firms compete and they generate some consumer surplus, but in addition, there is the consumer surplus from the startup. If there is a low type acquihire, the consumer surplus from the startup that disappears, but the structure between the two firms changes. Now one firm is more efficient in some sense, it's better in some sense, so the consumer surplus changes. And similarly, if there was a high type acquihire, there's a third level of consumer surplus. And things are really easy if the consumer surplus without an acquihire is either the highest or the lowest, right? If it's highest, then just don't do anything. Or no, if it's highest, then just prohibit any acquisition. If it's lowest, then allow all acquisitions. Things become interesting if consumers are harmed by a low type acquihire, but they benefit from a high type acquihire. So now you have a trade-off. If the policymakers can distinguish between types, again, matters become easy. But if they cannot, then things become slightly more interesting. So here is a result. So the first two bullet points, they basically just say what I have mentioned, if the consumer surplus is either highest or lowest. So what happens in this intermediate case? Well, what we show is that in this intermediate case, consumer surplus is going to decrease if and only if the probability of high matches is intermediate, right? Where this is some cutoff. And let me show you an intuition for this with a picture. So look at the right-hand side. So this is a simple Cournot model where we have actually calculated the numbers. And this dashed dotted line, the constant, this is the consumer surplus if there was no acquihire, if acquihires were prohibited. Right? So you see on the horizontal line is the probability of high match, vertical line is consumer surplus. So if all acquihires are prohibited, consumer surplus does not change with the probability of the high match. So now what would happen if a policymaker could identify high matches and only allow high matches? Then the consumer surplus would follow this dashed line. And of course, high matches are valuable. So the higher the probability of a high match, the higher expected consumer surplus. Now, what happens if acquihires are allowed? All acquihires are allowed. That's what we have in this purple line. And as you can see on the graph here, consumers lose. So the purple line is below this straight line only for these intermediate values. Why does this happen? Well, when the probability of a high type is very high, then it doesn't matter if you can identify them or not. All the matches are going to be high type anyway. So that's clear. What happens at the low end here? Now you have very few high matches, but endogenously, only high matches will result in an acquihire, right? Recall, a low type only acquires the startup in order to protect itself from the high match competitor. So if that high match competitor is not very likely, they're not going to do that. Okay? So you only have a loss of consumer surplus in these intermediate regions. And what the left-hand figure shows is that there's always that drop, but it's not sure that the drop is going to be high enough that the consumers actually lose, right? So in terms of the proposition here, this could be an empty interval. So kind of the message I take from this result is that in this setting, policy is not obvious, right? Because identifying situations where consumers lose is not immediate. And for the final result, I want to talk to you about hiring, separation, and unemployment. So hiring is kind of clear. I just want to tell you what we mean by these two terms. So separation, we use the word separation to indicate the scenario where the entrepreneur is employed. So we're going to add another period. And separation is going to mean the scenario where the entrepreneur is hired or acquihired by a firm in period 1, but then it is let go at the end of the period. If that entrepreneur is then not hired by the competitor, then we're going to talk about unemployment. Okay, so just to make sure you know what I mean when I use these words. What we're doing here is we're keeping period 1 the same as before. We're saying that there is a possibility that the economy is hit with a negative shock after period 1, and then period 2 kind of mirrors period 1. So what is going to happen is in period 2, the entrepreneur is going to have an option of creating another startup. So her outside option is going to be lowercase pi e again, right? So you can think of that as you have been acquired, you have worked some time for the firm, and now you can leave if you want. And if you leave, you're an entrepreneurial person, you can build a new startup. And if there was an acquihire, then the firm that hired the worker is the first one to make an offer for the continued employment. Okay, so that is the rule of period 2. So let me tell you now a little bit more about this negative shock in between periods. What can happen here is that, that there is some probability delta, exogenous probability delta, that the economy suffers a negative shock. Right? If there is a negative shock, what this is going to do is, if a downturn materializes, there's going to be some negative shock that could impact either one of the two firms or both or none, right? So when there is, so the way you should think about this is that when there is a recession, I might suffer, I might get hit by a negative shock. My competitor might suffer and get hit by a negative shock as well, right? But it's not necessary. Maybe there's a recession and I get away from it without any issues. So this just tells you that there's this combination of downgrades And the way we have decided to model this for simplicity is simply if there's a recession and you are hit with a negative shock, then if your match quality was high, it's going to be downgraded to low. Right? This is the simplest way we managed to model this. There are two parameters in these expressions. There's a parameter gamma. That's simply the probability that in case of a recession, you are downgraded. Right? This is just the probability that I'm downgraded if there's a recession. There's also this parameter R, which measures positive correlation between the firm's shocks. Right? And the way you should think about this is me and my competitor, we're in the same industry. So if I'm downgraded, I should learn something about the probability that my competitor is downgraded as well. Or if I'm not downgraded, well, maybe this is good news for the entire industry. And what we want to, the type of statements we want to make is we want to compare what happens when there is incentive to talent hoard versus the situation when there's no incentive to talent hoard. So for the benchmark, we're simply going to set these payoffs when the competitor makes the acquisition to be constant, right? And in this case, there's no incentives to talent hoard. And here is the result. The result says that whenever there is incentive for the firms to talent hoard, there will be more hiring, right? That's simple because now hiring brings you another benefit, right? You can protect yourself from the competitor, so you're going to do it more often. Slightly more subtle is this second part that says if this inequality holds, then the incentive to talent hoard is going to lead to more separation, right? More layoffs, and also to more unemployment, meaning layoffed people are not going to be hired by the other firm. Right? These are two different concepts. That's why we need two different elements here. I just want you to focus on the right-hand side. So the smaller the right-hand side, the easier this condition is to be satisfied. So this means when the probability that we suffer a downgrade is high, then there's going to be more layoffs. And also if our signals are more correlated, there's also going to be more layoffs, simply because when this happens, when these R and gamma are high, I learn more about the match quality of my competitor, either from simply observing a recession or from observing a negative shock to myself. Okay, so I don't want to overdo it. Thanks. I don't want to overdo this, but John Gruber, who is a commentator for the tech industry in 23, so this was after we had this result. He wrote on his website this thing that I kind of think captures the intuition that we're trying to get there. So I'm just going to read it out. There are numerous reasons the tech industry wound up at this layoff palooza, but I think the main reason is that the biggest companies got caught up in a game where they tried to hire everyone, whether they needed them or not, to keep talent away from competitors and keep talent away from small upstarts or from founding their own small upstarts. These big companies were just hiring to hire, and now the jig is up. Right? And kind of that is the intuition that we're trying to capture here as well. So my time is almost up. I'm not going to go over the extensions. I'm happy to talk to you about it afterwards. Thank you very much for your attention. And if there are any questions, I'm going to.
What is the relationship between your paper and a story of foreclosure? Because essentially you try to make sure that the rival doesn't get the inputs that he really needs.
Yes. So essentially we're trying to say that story applies in this setting as well. Right? So that is the extent of the message that we're trying to send. Right? So these acquihires, the story of foreclosure can apply to them as well. So you should not take acquihires as a defense at face value. That's exactly what we're trying to say.
It seems like the assumption of sequential move is quite important here. In principle, if the two firms were moving simultaneously, you wouldn't have any inefficiency in the allocation of the startup. And in principle, also the entrepreneur could solicit more bids if they're approached by a first firm and sort of essentially organize an auction for the startup.
Yes.
So it seems that there is some sort of friction here where firms don't know about acquisition opportunity. At least not all firms know about acquisition opportunities. I don't know if in the tech sector that's sort of common or not.
You're absolutely right. There needs to be some kind of a friction, and there are different ways in which you could build such a friction. I think this captures well the situation where there are many startups and many of them are completely worthless, and all of them would like to collect a paycheck. So potential acquirers really don't know all of the startups that could be valued, right? And so, yes.